This video was made possible thanks to CuriosityStream. Watch TLDR ad-free and get exclusive videos from us by signing up to the CuriosityStream Nebula bundle deal at curiositystream.com/TLDREU. In response to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, Western countries have imposed unprecedented sanctions on Russia, which have ruined Russia's economy. As well as crippling the ruble and spiking inflation, these sanctions might now force Russia into its second sovereign default in 25 years, with potentially catastrophic consequences for both Russia and the world. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at whether Russia will default on its debt, if it hasn't already, and what impact that might have on the wider global economy. Before we begin, currently only about a quarter of you are subscribed, so never miss a thing in this difficult time by subscribing and joining the TLDR gang. So, before we get into the recent crisis, a bit of context. Prior to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, Russia was considered one of the most creditworthy nations in the world. Investors liked lending money to Russia because its massive oil and gas exports provided it with a reliable source of foreign currency, and it had very little debt in the first place. From 2000 until 2020, Russia's government debt-to-GDP ratio averaged about 20%, and from 2005 to 2019, it stayed below 15%. Russia actually ran budget surpluses, i.e. they borrowed less money than they spent, in 7 out of the last 10 years. For context, US debt-to-GDP has averaged about 100% for the last decade or so, and thanks to increased borrowing over the pandemic, now sits at about 120%. The average debt-to-GDP ratio across the EU is about 90%, ranging from 19% in Estonia to 206% in Greece. This means that, prior to the invasion, every country in the bloc had a higher debt-to-GDP ratio than Russia. Anyway, you get the point. Just a few years ago, Russia had very little debt, and it wasn't struggling to pay it off. This has all changed with the invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent sanctions. The sanctions have made it nearly impossible for Russia to pay back its existing debt for 3 reasons. First, half of its central bank reserves have been seized, which means it just got less money to play with. Second, Russia has been banned from borrowing more money on the international bond market, which means it can't borrow to cover the pre-existing costs. And third, the ruble can't be converted into foreign currency, which means it can't be used to cover debt denominated in other currencies. Somewhat unsurprisingly, Russia has already implied that it will be defaulting on some of its debts if the sanctions aren't lifted. Russia currently has about $240 billion worth of debt in the form of government bonds. For those of you who don't know, governments sell bonds to investors in order to borrow money. Governments pay regular interest on the bonds to the investors until the bond matures, which is when they then pay back the full value. Now, most of these bonds don't mature for a while, i.e. Russia doesn't have to pay back all of the $240 billion anytime soon, but it still has to pay regular interest payments. Luckily for Russia, most of this debt, about $200 billion worth, is denominated in ruble, which the government has enough of. However, about $40 billion of this ruble-denominated debt is owed to overseas investors who live outside of Russia. Russia has already said that it won't be paying interest payments on this debt, because Russia has imposed a ban on sending large amounts of currency abroad. The remaining $40 billion of Russia's total debt is denominated in foreign currency, which means that Russia has to pay it back in dollars, pounds, euros, or Swiss francs. Some of the bonds have a special clause in them which says that Russia can pay them back in rubles if Russia is unable to make the payment for, quote, reasons beyond its control, but most of them don't. Of this $40 billion, about $20 billion is owed to investors outside of Russia. Again, Russia has said that it'll probably end up defaulting on at least some of these. On March the 13th, Russia's finance minister said that Russia would only pay countries that have been unfriendly to the Russian Federation in rubles, which would constitute a default. Now, it's not clear whether Russia has actually defaulted. On Thursday, the Russian finance minister claimed that Russia had paid $117 million interest payments on 2 dollar-denominated bonds, due on Wednesday. But he seemed to imply that Russia had tried to pay via one of the central bank's frozen accounts. This has created quite a legal quagmire, but ultimately it's sort of irrelevant. Whether it's this interest payment or the next, a default in the near future is inevitable. Credit rating agencies currently rate Russia's debt as junk, which is the lowest rating available, and Russian debt is trading at 20 cents on the dollar, which essentially means that markets think there's an 80% chance that Russia will default on its debt. So Russia looks set for a default. So what happens then? Well, there would usually be what's called a restructuring, which would involve Russia and its investors sorting out some sort of new deal to avoid an official default. In this case, however, a restructuring looks unlikely. Russia is banned from borrowing more on the international markets, which means that it can't really offer investors anything. Instead, it's just going to have to accept the default. While this is bad news for investors, there probably won't be too many immediate consequences for the broader financial system. The last time Russia defaulted on its debt in 1998, it sent shockwaves through the global financial system, leading to the near collapse of US hedge fund long-term capital management and its bailout by a consortium of banks. Scary as this might sound, a repeat of 1998 looks unlikely. For starters, the 1998 crisis was a surprise, coming hot off the heels of the Asian financial crisis. This time, markets are already expecting a default, and overseas investors have been steadily taking their money out of Russia since the first round of sanctions were introduced in 2014, so exposure is limited. But while a Russian default might not trigger an immediate financial crisis, it's still very bad news for Russia. Unsurprisingly, investors don't like sovereign defaults. After all, why would you want to lend your money to a country that has a track record of defaulting on its debts? It's likely that this default, Russia's second in 25 years, will push Russia's borrowing costs sky high, even after the war's over. We've promoted it a few times, but we do have another video where we run through the impact of this on the global economy, the potential hypothetical impact of the war on every country, including yours. That video is exclusively on Nebula, the streaming service my creator friends and I have teamed up to build, where we don't need to worry about demonetization or the algorithm. Over there you can find all of our latest videos ad-free, and we've already got a bunch of content exclusively over on Nebula, which will never come to YouTube. It's not just us either. All of our favourite educational creators are already there, like Wendover Productions, Real Life Law, Polymatter, Legal Eagle, Half as Interesting, and many more. But wait, we said that this video was brought to you by CuriosityStream, right? Well, as a platform full of the best documentaries online, they naturally love educational creators like us. As such, we've worked out a deal whereby if you sign up to CuriosityStream using the link below, you'll also get access to Nebula. That's not a free trial either. You'll get access for as long as you're a member. To make things even better, for a limited time, they're offering a deal where you can get 26% off their already low price, making an entire year of both streaming services less than $15. Less than $15 a year for all your favourite educational creators, as well as superb documentaries on a whole bunch of topics, including Hidden Russia, a breathtaking documentary about the country, and The Spying Game, which goes deep into the secrets of Cold War tactics. Signing up at curiositystream.com/TLDREU or clicking the link below not only gets you the deal, but it also directly supports TLDR and educational content on the platform more generally, as well as getting you original content and an ad-free experience.